female vote. As we approach another election day, I'm reminded, as I often am, of the struggles that led to women's voices being heard. It's an especially exciting time for us when we have a woman running for the highest office in the United States, and that's for the President of the United States. What satisfaction our trailblazers would have at this notion. The right for women to vote was not a novel idea. In the late 1700s, the Constitution of the United States was adopted. Abigail Adams, who was wife of President Adams, requested that the women's voices be heard. It fell on deaf ears, as usual. Women had their place. In 1840, Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia Mott met in London at a World Anti-Slavery Convention. They quickly formed a friendship that lasted a long time. Stanton quoted it as saying that her earliest memory engraved on her was when her sister was born, and all she can remember her mother's friends remarking is, "It's a pity there's a girl." She did not understand at that time that girls were considered an inferior of beings. When Lucretia and Elizabeth left the convention and went to their respective homes, they continued in the fight. In 1845, Mott was considered to be the first public suffrage speech. Mott was made what was considered by many to be the first public speech to Quaker women in Ohio. Also in 1845, the women were instrumental in setting up the Women's Right Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. In preparation for the convention, they drafted a Declaration of Sentiments, which was based on the Declaration of Independence, and it began, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." The convention lasted 2 days, included many speakers. It was attended by more than 300 women and men. One woman of history to note that was there was Susan B. Anthony. The convention was considered a success by all. The press covered it, but not favorably. They called it a hen party, and they were quoted as saying that the women were trying to abolish the Bible, which was not true at all. Events in the country continued to motivate the women during their suffrage movement. In 1875, the Supreme Court handed down the decision that women could not vote under the 14th Amendment. Susan B. Anthony, once again a pioneer in the battle for this, demanded to be heard. And on November 1st, 1872, she registered, her and 14 other women registered to vote. And 4 days later, on November 5th, they did vote. 2 weeks later, she was arrested for voting when she knew that she didn't have the lawful right to do so. She was tried on June 17th, 1873, before a jury and found guilty and ordered to pay a fine of $100, which she refused to pay and never did. In the 1970s, the Equals Right Amendment was first used. The name attached to the bill introduced in Congress to give women a vote. The struggle continued. Meantime, women in other countries were granted the right to vote, Scandinavia being the first, and in 1906, Finland allowed their women to vote. Many of the suffragists were jailed and arrested. In 1913, Alice Paul led 8,000 women dressed in white to march on the nation's capital, and this was during the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. Some of the bystanders slapped the women and burned them with cigar butts and were eventually breaking up the march. President Wilson's reaction was to show no indifference. In 1917, pickets began on a vigil at the White House, and it lasted 6 months. It was during this time that Carrie Chapman Catt was also on the mission of obtaining a right to vote for women. She preferred to use different tactics than the others, mainly by Paul. She organized grassroots support for her suffrage, thinking she would have a better chance of changing people's minds. he got President Woodrow Wilson to speak at the suffrage convention, used his influence in Congress to get a women's suffrage amendment passed. After 70 years, the struggle finally came to an end. Many of the tenacious women would not live to see the flight of their struggle. In 1919, the 19th Amendment was prepared by Congress. The amendment was also aptly called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. It won by a very narrow margin, and it was ratified in 1920. Now, 64 years later, in 1984, Geraldine Ferraro ran on a ticket with Walter Mondale, running for vice president for the Democratic Party. 88 years later, we have our first Democratic female running for president, who is Hillary Clinton. Who knows what can happen in the next 88 years. So as we approach this election, when I go in to vote, I'm going to say a silent prayer and thank these women for their struggles that allowed me and my daughter and my mother and future generations the right to vote.